Right, hi Ron, thanks for joining us for another session as part of our Decolonisation in Practice conference. It is really great to be joined by Sharon and Tara from Don't Settle, who are going to be talking to us about the work that they've been doing that's partly with the heritage sector. So yeah, take it away.
Thank you very much. Yes, as I said, I'm Sharon Dander. I'm the producer of Don't Settle. Tara?
I'm Tara. I hold various roles in Don't Settle.
Brilliant. You'll hear more about that in a second. So just to break down the structure of what we're going to do today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the project, and we'll both talk about how we got involved and also what our involvement is. Then we'll share a little bit more of a personal background just so you can understand a bit about what's motivated us to get into these roles. And then towards the end, myself and Tara are going to have a little bit more of a natural discussion, and we encourage you to join in on the chat if you like as well. So I'm just going to share my screen and get started. Cool, so you should be able to see that. So as I mentioned, we're a project called Don't Settle. Yep, I've told you what I'm covering. So Don't Settle empowers 16 to 25-year-old people of colour in Birmingham and the Black Country to change the voice of heritage through the arts, research and governance. We are funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. We're a 3-year project and we're currently in our 2nd year. It's part of the wider Kick the Dust scheme, which funds 12 projects to challenge organisations to kind of improve their youth engagement, hence the name, so actively inviting young people to kick the dust off heritage. Our project specifically is run by Beat Freaks. We're an organisation and we're based in Birmingham. And Don't Settle's focus is specifically on the relationships that heritage institutions have with their communities of colour, and truly believing in young people in becoming the sort of new generation of custodians of that heritage. So we are partnered with Birmingham City University, so we've got a research partner. We're partnered with Birmingham Museums Trust. We've been working with Chance Heritage Trust, who are based in the Black Country in Smethwick for the last year. And then this year we've brought in partnership with Roundhouse Birmingham as well. So they're very different kinds of institutions as well. So we're learning from sort of Birmingham Museums Trust, which is a very old existing institution and organisation. Chance is more of an urban regeneration project, but it still has elements of heritage and it's very, very new. And Roundhouse is going to be opening next year. So it's really interesting to work with very different partners. How did we start? So in 2016, Beat Freaks Arts ran a project called At What Cost? That was based at Warwick Castle and it was looking into the gardens, and it basically brought together connections of the transatlantic slave trade in wider National Trust, but also in a lot of heritage institutions and specifically at Warwick Castle in the garden. And Lancelot Capability Brown does a lot of work on Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, and a lot of his work centres on that. So he did a kind of project with the community there, and we found that the community really resonated to that. They found it really surprising that a lot of these issues were getting talked about, and we noticed that that shouldn't be the case, that it shouldn't just be a surprise and it shouldn't just be one project doing that. At the same time, in Birmingham, Beat Freaks Arts and National Lottery Heritage Fund ran something called Roots to Roots, which was about a lot of young people questioning what their culture and their identity meant here in Britain. For us, it was really, this project came out as a response to that kind of need. So people clearly wanted to explore their heritage and their identity, but they were also questioning kind of who are making the decisions and what narratives are told in that sector as well. So Don't Settle kind of brought those two things together. There are 3 key things that drives us. So number 1, wanting change in the sector. Culture and cultural and heritage institutions are where people go to learn about the past. They observe how society has progressed and the conversations around that, but also they reflect on our place in society today. The histories and narratives presented in these institutions should therefore also be inclusive of those communities, especially in places like Birmingham Black Country, where you often find that you could be stood in a museum or a heritage institution, you could be looking at things around you, but the communities that you're seeing in that space and represented in that space doesn't necessarily reflect what's out the window. We believe that inclusivity should be applied as an attitude and an approach to different levels of heritage organisations, as opposed to just doing work around equality and diversity in certain departments or as a policy that sits separately. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And again, it's championing more sustainable attempts rather than kind of tokenistic one-off projects of decolonisation. Another thing that drives us is that we centre young people of colour. This means centering them not just as target audience, but actually the people doing the work. So a lot of our programs are for people of colour and primarily designed for them in mind. So it's making them a primary audience, but a primary consideration as consultants and thinkers in the work as well. We want to make sure that they're not just given a platform to tell their story, but they actually become the ones who have ownership of how that's done. They're given the autonomy in our project, and they actually guide the project rather than us just guiding them. And that is what we believe that will make them feel empowered to eventually lead development that they want to see in the sector. And in order to give that autonomy and achieve change together, co-design and co-production are kind of two core things in our Beat Freaks methodology, but especially in Don't Settle. So we try and ensure that that takes place in many areas. That's obviously co-design between us, co-design between our partners and young people, co-design between all of us, and just in as many decisions as possible, making sure that they're involved. So we try and champion them over kind of anything that the project is doing. Today, Tara is one of the people who is kind of involved in the project in various ways. So we've brought her along to speak, and hopefully you'll be hearing more from her and less from me. So how do we actually do all of that? What we like to think about is we kind of have 4 key strands that there's tangible outputs and things that we do, but it's also about what those strands interrogate and inquire into the sector together and how they all fit together. So over here, we've got the Curators Program, which is about looking at the relationships between the heritage sector and its people of colour audiences in specific. And therefore, in order to do that, you have to look at the narratives that are told, what is on offer for those audiences, what programming, what is that relationship looking like, and who is represented in that. So we run a program for young people to actually do that with our partners. Then that needs to come sort of hand in hand with governance. So interrogating the decision-making processes and the power structures in the sector. So in order to have sustainable change, you need to have representation at the top as well. And we facilitate spaces for young people to work with our partner organisations to design new youth engagement structures that allow young people of colour to be in those positions, or also the other way around, allow the sector kind of open up, sharing some of that power or redistributing that power. Lunar campfires are, so we interrogate the way that heritage spaces are actually used. So they're obviously massive buildings, they're really safe spaces, and they're supposed to be open spaces, but have they actually been open spaces, and have they actually responded to what the community might need? Our project deals with a lot of sensitive themes, and a lot of the things are things that people have carried with them quite personally, so you need to deal with that in a similar way. So the Lunar Campfires are open discussion events that are also designed and run by young people to actually talk about things to do with race representation and people's personal identity. And then the last bit is research. So we run a program called Unlocked, and we work with young people who are called research residents to creatively interpret the research that we'd like to share out, but also to continuously kind of bring these parts together in discussion and see how they're working and see how we work and what's coming from that. I'm just going to stop sharing this for a second, switch over, if that's all right. Cool. So in terms of what motivated me into this role, well, it brought together my personal interest in the museum sector. So my background is in art and design, and then I did a master's in museum and gallery studies. And I really wanted to make a change in the sector because a lot of the discourse at the moment is about accessibility and the relationships that museums have with different communities, questioning kind of what the museum's social responsibility to those communities are, and just the overall purpose that the museum serves. Really recently, there's been a lot more dialogue and work around decolonisation, and our project kind of lends itself to challenging those colonial legacies. There's a huge collective trauma and pain that people feel in relation to heritage, and that's something that needs to be not only acknowledged, but continuously validated and worked through. Don't Settle was also a project for me that I felt would let me kind of explore my own identity and the confusion that's come with growing up in the UK as a person of colour. So it resonated with that passion, and it was a chance for me to kind of start to challenge that discrimination and champion inclusivity. Tara?
So hi, my name is Tara. I am a student currently. I also hold various positions at Don't Settle, like I said. Currently, so I studied at the University of Birmingham for 3 years for my BSc in psychology. And I'm currently studying my MSc in mental health at the same university. So I'm still at the University of Birmingham. So in terms of Don't Settle, I am a Luna resident. a consortium board member as a young person advisor, and I'm also an unlocked researcher, the programs that Sharon described. So what motivated me to the project? So growing up, I mostly saw a lot of organizations, industries, and spaces that were largely white dominated, and still to this day is the case. There were no conversations held around race and race-related issues, and the lack of BIPOC representation in various industries, whether that's social media or just media in general. So films, music videos, advertisements, we didn't see people who look like us a lot. And it seemed like no one was really talking about that. And so as a Black woman, I started to really become comfortable reading and kind of settle with the fact that there would be certain difficulties that I would not be able to talk about. And there were certain things about the system that I just could not change. And there were certain roles that I could never occupy simply because they were not created for me. And I was just not to exist in those spaces. And as I looked around me and observed the structures around me and the explicit yet seemingly implicit, it pretends to be implicit, right? But to be honest, to people of color, it's quite explicit, it's quite bold, it's quite loud. So as I realized the barriers to my career development, I started to feel incredibly voiceless and quite frankly, just socially defeated until I found Untitled and realized their commitment to giving a voice to BIPOC and to empowering young people of color and changing these various industries and the institutional barriers within them. So whether that be the heritage sector or the research industry and so much more, really, they just encourage us to challenge these spaces. And I was also attracted to the extent to which they encourage young BIPOC to take up space and how much they encouraged us to abandon, our self-limiting beliefs. And I think that a lot of these things are very much internalized as a young person of color. If you grow up seeing that you're not represented in a lot of spaces, seeing that, there's limits to the things that you can do, and it's eventually you start to internalize it. And that can, you can start to then develop just very self-limiting beliefs such as, no, I cannot do that. Often I saw people in academic roles or lecturers, and I always thought to myself, there's no way I could ever be a lecturer, just because I never saw someone who looked like me as a lecturer. So I really was attracted to the way that Don't Settle kind of encourage us to just abandon these self-limiting beliefs. And they do that through the work that empowers us. They really encourage us to have a voice and to play a role in reshaping and restructuring these systems. So yeah.
Thank you very much. I promise I didn't pay her to say that. So just to go a little bit deeper into some of our personal experiences, one of the most important things to me growing up was that I didn't really feel like I understood a lot about how I felt growing up in the UK. So although I could identify some of those key feelings like being uncomfortable or feeling quite unnerved in some situations, feeling quite small in some situations, and just sometimes feeling genuinely unwanted as an audience member, things generally weren't talked about. It wasn't until I was a lot older and having conversations around race and representation that I was actually able to identify the things that we now can understand as microaggressions or internalization and bias and false inclusion and racial gatekeeping and all of these things. This isn't also supposed to be kind of like a sob story or anything. It's more highlighting the reality of what my existence has been and what kind of the thought processes have been. And it's the case for a lot of young people of colour that I've spoken to as well. I grew up trying to balance and find individuality in two different cultures. And instead of being able to see it as belonging to both, I saw it as being kind of pulled in two different directions and therefore not belonging to either. Or at least that's kind of that's what I experienced growing up from what I saw. I realized then how important the kind of influence around you is growing up. So firstly, that starts with your personal circle. I was lucky enough to go to quite a multicultural high school, so I felt quite comfortable growing up with people that looked like me. I was able to learn about other cultures from talking to like classmates and friends, and I didn't really feel like an outsider amongst my peers, which is a very lucky and privileged position for myself to have been in. However, positions of authority in the schools, such as teachers, were all held by white individuals. So I actually remember a moment being really taken and feeling just quite happy that we had an Indian female teacher join. Still remember her name, still remember the subject she taught, still remember the year she joined. And for me at the time, I didn't really know why. I didn't know why I was really happy, why I kind of felt connected to her. I was only able to reflect back that the feeling that gave me was a sense of hope that I also could be in a similar role. So that doesn't mean that I necessarily wanted to become a teacher, but it was more the hope for the opportunity to eventually be able to succeed in similar roles. And then what I realized was that the days that I feel like that shouldn't have been so few and far in between, the fact that I'm able to kind of recall the year, the name, the subject, they shouldn't be isolated memories. That pattern was kind of echoed for me everywhere. So I went to the University of Leeds, and that was predominantly white in terms of staff and students, in terms of what I saw. And I still get shocked and surprised every time I see like a brown person on a film or a TV program, especially when they're being portrayed not in a way that's stereotyping culture, or not in a way that's deliberately just there to teach culture, but just seeing them naturally existing and actually just shown living their life. I actually want to quickly pick up on a point that Tara made in one of our kind of previous conversations, but she was saying that it's really important to have people that you see and influencers and role models that are just people of colour genuinely enjoying themselves, being happy, being successful, as opposed to seeing everyone who is an activist or people constantly having to fight for equality. And I think that's a really important point, that actually the pressure to feel like you're constantly fighting something every day is a lot. So it's really important to see people that's just normalizing kind of that happy existence. So other things, I've seen people kind of accept parts of our culture and parts of my cultures, like Indian food, but then other aspects of the culture get ridiculed and still are ostracized, which is kind of brings you into the point of appropriation over appreciation, because it's sort of exploitation, and it's still really interesting how you can turn a blind eye to a lot of other stuff but then still pick what you want. I've seen my mother read, write and speak 4 languages fluently, but her intelligence in this country is actually judged on her ability in her 5th language, which is English, and then therefore she's treated because of that. And that kind of holds this this view that kind of whiteness and then predominantly speaking English spaces are the norm, and it becomes a hierarchy. I become very sort of self-conscious and self-aware in public spaces, especially in predominantly white towns. I become very aware that I'm being looked at. Even though that's not necessarily kind of racial behavior, it's still, the point I'm trying to make is the exhaustion of kind of being so self-aware of yourself all the time, especially as a young child. As women, and I use that term quite broadly, we're taught by society to be quite conscious of our safety, as an example. So you're kind of told and taught to make decisions that aren't, well, at least when I was growing up, it might be a little bit different now, but you're kind of taught to not put yourself in danger. You're more at risk and you need to be more aware. But as a person of colour, you're always aware of being a person of colour as well. And you're always aware of the barriers and the limitations that you are eventually going to have to face. And they're conversations that family, you have to think about how you're going to have those conversations. Your siblings, your older siblings, they kind of take on that responsibility to help you navigate those spaces. And that's just an extra layer of thinking that exists there. The point I'm trying to make is not just kind of give a list of all these things, but I want to kind of emphasize that because of all those things, it's representation and acknowledgement that are 2 really key things that eventually will lead to inclusivity. So representation kind of helps you feel not only accepted, but less excluded and more present as a, I hate the word normal, but as a kind of equal member of society, as opposed to having to go and source that information out. In school, I know everyone talks about like curriculum and stuff like that, but I think for me it was just so exhausting to have to, if there was anything I wanted to learn about myself or people that looked like me or my friends and stuff, I'd have to really go out of my way to find that information and trust that information, as opposed to it being quite readily available for me. Yeah, I'm going to hand it over to Tara now to kind of pick up on that.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I just want to give a disclaimer. My Wi-Fi is really bad all of a sudden, so I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me, Sharon? Okay. Yeah? Okay. I'm gonna try. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Obviously it's never easy, so thank you for opening up about it all. So for me, it was, growing up in schools that use the Cambridge system. So I'm from Botswana. Can you hear me?
You cut out just a little bit, but I think you're back.
Okay, can you hear? Okay, so I was born in, yeah, is it good now? Okay, so then raised, so that's in, and adopted the Cambridge system. So it's almost like we're learning here, really. And so adopting a system like that, there was no sort of embracing our own culture, embracing the culture from back home. And I think that definitely played a role in kind of reinforcing the idea that whiteness is the norm. So those sorts of things. And then, so it's kind of like the effects of colonialism are evident in the learning system and the school rules and the school system. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, use the Cambridge system. And so, for instance, one of the rules that I feel like was an evidence of, the colonial era was we weren't allowed to speak English in the school. So you were only, you weren't allowed to speak Setswana in the school. You were only to speak English. Can you hear me? Because it keeps cutting out. Is that okay? Okay, so I'm going to repeat that just in case people didn't hear. Just give me a thumbs up.
Yeah,
if you can hear.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. So yeah, so as I said, the effects of colonialism were evident in the learning system and the school rules that we had. For example, we weren't allowed to speak the native language, which is Setswana. So when we were on school grounds, we were only to speak English. And something like that, as I said, it just reinforces the idea that whiteness is the norm. And really just to try, and I'm going to use very blunt terms here, and I apologize if this is somewhat triggering, intimidating, or threatening. But it was really trying to whitewash the system. And there was no evidence of the Botswana culture in our learning or in just the schools in general. And so, yeah, and there was also some sort of need to assimilate and accommodate. So by assimilate, I mean, kind of, as I said, the whole idea of whiteness is the norm. So we need to kind of, in order to be accepted and just taken a bit more seriously, you have to assimilate as a person of color. Can you hear me? Okay, I'm just gonna keep talking. Oh.
Yeah, we can hear you, Tara.
Okay, just give me a second, just try something with the Wi-Fi.
Sure. Just to fill the silence, I'm just going to say this has truly been the sounds of the year, I think. Just, sorry, can you hear me? You're on mute, I think is a common phrase as well.
Yeah, so sorry about that. It's been really bad. So yeah, I don't know where I started to cut off, but basically, as I was saying, was that along with the idea of whiteness being reinforced as a norm in our schools and our learning, there was also that sort of thing that was happening in our homes. So for example, my first name is Dumelo, which is Setswana, and my middle name is actually Tara. But growing up, my entire family always referred to me as Tara. And I never really questioned this growing up, so it was never a problem. But then as I started to get older, and especially when I moved to the West, so I moved to England 3 years ago for school. So when I moved to the West, that's when I started to kind of question things and sort of wonder, what is the need to sort of refer to me by, my English name? So is it perhaps because it's more pronounceable? Is it perhaps to ensure that, maybe I can use this name when I'm kind of filling in some applications or I'm putting my name down on something, and is it to assimilate essentially? And these are sorts of things that I feel like they connect to the whole thing of not being allowed to speak Setswana in our schools, and only being able to speak English in our schools. So those things really connect. You start to see the need for people of color to assimilate and accommodate in order to fit into this mold as like whiteness as a norm, in order to appease those societal standards. And then another thing that was really interesting for me growing up is what we learned about in school. So in history lessons, for example, we learned so much about, the causes of the Second World War and Hitler rising and those things, but we never learned about apartheid and slavery and colonialism. Those are things that I had to essentially teach myself as I got older. And I wonder what the reason is for doing that. What is the need to sort of retell the story in a way that praises the successes, or, the quote unquote successes, but kind of amidst the evils and the wrongdoings that have been done. And as I said, I'm sorry for the very loose terms that I'm using and speaking explicitly, I guess. Can everyone still hear me?
Yeah, you're a lot better now.
Great, because you're frozen. I'm just gonna keep talking even though you're frozen.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And yeah, so as I said, the lessons that we learned in history classes very much did not learn about we didn't learn about our culture first and foremost, but then more than anything, we didn't learn about our history and our lineage and how our people came to be, and their history and their pain and their trauma. It was very much like, we're just going to tell you about all these other things, and we're going to tell you about, it was a very Europe-centered curriculum. But more than anything, it was a Europe-centered curriculum that did not tell the full story. So it was your responsibility as a person of color to then go out and seek the necessary information so you can essentially inform yourself. And I think it's the responsibility of the schools to tell the whole story. If you're going to tell the story at all, tell the whole story. And that's something that we just did not see growing up. And also learning from teachers who didn't look like me, so I couldn't identify with them. I think in all my education, most of my teachers were expats. Most of them were South African, so actually white female South African women. And so that was also very difficult because I just couldn't identify with them. I couldn't see myself as ever being able to occupy those roles. And in terms of the way that we just didn't embrace our culture growing up, and how it was a very whitewashed society, and a society where you could just see the remnants of colonialism and the standards that had been set by colonialism. I went to a UWC, so United World College, and it was at Waterford. That was in Swaziland, in Africa as well. And a UWC school, just to give a bit of context, is a school that literally, the aim is to bring people from all over the world together under one learning environment so that we can start to embrace different cultures, and so that we can start to learn about different cultures. So I remember we had UWC Day, and everyone was supposed to, wear some sort of traditional dress. You're supposed to make some sort of traditional food of yours. And this was a boarding school, mind you. So you're supposed to bring some sort of traditional food of yours, and then you're supposed to say something about your culture, something that you're proud of, something that you can share with the audience, anything at all. And I remember being around my friends who were from Norway and America and Australia and Tanzania and Kenya and Namibia and South Africa. And I remember being around them, and they were very much proud of their culture. They were sharing all this information to us, and they were so proud of it. They were so proud of what they were saying. They were so proud of their identities and their heritage. And I remember I didn't have a traditional dress because I didn't own one. And I couldn't talk so much about my culture because I realized that I didn't know as much as I should have. And sure, I made a dish, but that was the simplest thing to do. But in terms of speaking about the cultural significance of certain things, I couldn't do that. And that's when I realized that I truly lived in a society that didn't uplift its people and didn't encourage them to know exactly who they are, and to really feel empowered in who they are, not only in their skin, but in where you come from and who the people who came before you are. It wasn't that way at all. And then, of course, then I came to the University of Birmingham, and I moved here 3 years ago, as I said. And for me, the thing that really strikes me was, out of all the lecturers, I think I've had 12 lecturers in my entire learning, in my entire degree. And there's only been one woman of color, and she was a Black woman. And it's minimum 12 lecturers. So again, to not be able to see people who look like you in those leadership roles, it does do something to your identity. and it's not to be taken lightly at all. It does do something to your identity in the sense that it communicates something about where you can and cannot exist in society. It communicates something about the barriers that exist, whether that is a conscious decision to not hire women of color or not. The impact is it's significant and it needs to be acknowledged. So yeah, that was really my observations growing up.
Thank you very much. Thank you for taking us through that and sharing. That was really insightful. I really want to pick up on what you're talking about in terms of like a single story. There's a brilliant TED talk, by the way, if anyone's not seen it, about the dangers of a single story. But you're right, I think, especially in the curriculum and what you learn, it's not just, so you talked about the fact that you didn't even learn about things like the apartheid. We in school did, but again, it's kind of the way that information is presented as well is such a key role and a key factor. And even the way that we learn about things as fact from our perspective. We still learn about it as fact rather than being taught about things as it being from a British perspective. And I had a moment in uni where I was just in a seminar and we were discussing like the theme of commemoration in museums and stuff. And one of he was an East Asian student, and he talked about like World War II, and he said a date that it ended, and then someone else challenged him, was like, that's not when it ended like this date here, and it ended this year. And everyone in the room was kind of like, yeah, that person's right. But then the East Asian student was like, no, because all they've ever known is it taught from their perspective. And it's only when you go into spaces that you're being exposed to different kinds of thinking, and you need to actually go to that thinking with an open mind, that you're not I don't want to say right, but you've been taught in a way that you're led to believe that this is the only truth. And I think that's really, really dangerous. Especially in heritage, things are presented as if it's kind of one truth, and the way things are communicated in that way, as opposed to communicating these are the different perspectives. So even when things are acknowledged in heritage in terms of like colonialism, they're still very acknowledged from a similar viewpoint. It's still very left in the past, whereas a lot of people don't believe that it's something that's left in the past, because we still feel the ramifications and the effects of those structures today. Or it's communicated in a way that's very kind of celebratory, but even if they're trying to acknowledge difficult things, they're still kind of communicating them by saying that it's one truth, as opposed to here's the opposite side and here's the other side of that story. So what I want to do is go a little bit into more of a natural discussion between us about this idea of tokenism and this idea of sort of inauthenticity around when people do try and decolonize or acknowledge things. And I want to move into discussing for about the next 10 minutes how that comes across to you. When do you start to notice that, and what things do you start to pick out as kind of like tropes of this doesn't feel authentic to me? And then how can we move forward in situations or scenarios where it does start to feel that way? So we'll make it more of a conversation, but obviously if people would like to throw some stuff in the chat as part of that discussion, I'll keep an eye out and kind of bring those points into it as well.
Yeah, perfect.
Oh, just for that, and then we'll go to a Q&A, so a broader Q&A about anything. So yeah. So what feels
yeah. Can you ask the question again?
So what to you feels tokenistic or inauthentic? I'm definitely coming from a perspective of heritage, but in general, I guess.
Yeah. So I think that with the emergence of BLM, Black Lives Matter movement, and especially the recent current events, I think we've seen a lot of people, it's almost as if they've kind of experienced something of an awakening. So a lot of institutions, I know the talk of decolonizing the curriculum has been happening for several years now, but it seems that with the emergence and the rise of BLM and everything we've been hearing recently, so by recently, I mean within the past 4 months, there's been a lot of conversations going on. A lot of things are erupting suddenly. So I feel like with that happening, it's almost like people are starting to kind of say, okay, we need to change everything. What can we do to change things? What can we do to prevent these things from happening? What can we do to eradicate racism and oppression and these systems that do oppress? And so with that happening, I feel like what ends up happening is that sometimes people do something and they think that they are trying to, you know, make things better for people of color, but really sometimes it can either be performative or, as Sharon said, be tokenistic. So something that's inauthentic would look like, I think firstly, before I say this, is that whatever effort that you're making, it's important that you're open to the fact that it might not be enough. And it's important that you're open to the fact that you might not actually be helping the people that you're trying to help. And the way that you ensure that what you're doing doesn't come from a place of inauthenticity or is not tokenistic is that you listen to the people of color that you're actually trying to help. So the very people that you're trying to help, you make sure that more than anything, you prioritize their voice. You make sure that you are leaving the door open to say, let me know if what I'm doing is wrong. But what feels tokenistic more than anything is when people make efforts, I don't know, such as, so this is an example that I'm going to give. I won't get too much into it, but basically something that looks tokenistic is in a Canvas activity or university activity sheet or whatever, the person's name is a non-Western name, such as Priyanka rather than Sarah. This seems like, I understand what the point is. I understand what the people are trying to do, but certainly it's not enough. So things that are tokenistic and inauthentic look like that, or as I said, just doing things and you're not opening yourself up for criticism. For as long as we're on this journey to try to decolonize the curriculum, we have to understand that in order to decolonize the curriculum, we have to acknowledge the fact that the system that we currently have was built on oppression. And if you cannot admit that to yourself, and if you cannot admit that to your colleagues and, you know, the people in your institution, then there's nothing is going to change. So, and I also want to say that to decolonize is not to diversify. So we see it a lot these days where certain organizations and industries sort of say, oh, but look, we've got a diverse cast, or we've got a diverse group of people working in our industry. That doesn't mean it's decolonized. And so that's something that I also really want to drive home. And so, yeah, so really, yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, no, well, discussions are back and forth. I agree with what you're saying about it's not enough sometimes. And I think that's what feels tokenistic to me, when it's everything else is exactly the same. And you've kind of thrown this one element that you're like, this will be enough. And I think you can feel the inauthenticity. You can feel that the attitude has just been to appease rather than to genuinely make that change in yourself. No change is ever going to be easy, otherwise everyone would constantly be changing and constantly doing that. And then you need to see the work that people have gone, and I don't mean you need to see the work that it's taken to get to a certain exhibition or get to that name in that paper, but you need to see that it connects to other things and it connects to other work. I remember in school, like you said about like a name, it was funny, like when I saw a name, I think it was like J Deep or something, and I was like, it's not John, it's not kind of stereotypical British names, but to me that was amusing because it was like a flagged, it was like, it wasn't just kind of made normalized, it wasn't part of like other work that was going on as well. It really did just feel like, do you think that's enough? Do you think you're done, you've checked it? That's one of the things that I discussed quite early in the project, is that the project discussed it, but we discussed that like decolonization as a process, as a verb, and as something that needs to be done, I find it quite dangerous as well, in terms of the fact that someday will people be able to go, we've decolonized, like we did that, let's move on. And it's the fact that there's so many fractures of it, and acknowledging those fractures and keeping the attitude and mentality that it's always needing work and it's always going to need to be open to that change. What makes it feel less tokenistic. In terms of some of the difficult conversations, so we work with our partners, and a lot of them do have like predominantly white staff. The way those conversations, and we've seen that their conversations and their kind of dismantling of some of this has changed throughout the year, not through the years, but like over the last year has been amazing. So like initially topics that were really quite uncomfortable, we kind of created that space to say that it's okay for it to be comfortable. Of course it's uncomfortable, that's why no one talks about it, but you need to not, it was understanding the kind of defense mechanism, really understanding why. And a lot of it was that, say, if you talk to white individual about this, they take it as a personal blame, because they're like, well, I am white, so therefore I am all of those things, and I take that blame for all those things that you're saying. However, it's not about that. It's about the fact that you aren't then letting people of colour share raw, honest, and quite, like you said, unapologetic ways of communicating that. So you're still having to police yourself on how you're communicating. So then is there ever really an honest exchange if you're constantly, it's like defense mechanisms, and it's people then kind of trying to word it in a way that's okay still, or, and I don't mean be offensive, but in a way that you don't want to lose the person that you're talking to. But we've seen that slowly happen. It's always a progress as opposed to a one time, I'm really inspired, I'm done, I've decolonised my brain, I've unlearned my bias. It's always going to be a slow progress for everyone to take responsibility for. And then now that our partners are kind of bringing up conversations themselves, when we kind of give them some feedback or something, or we want to change the way they're framing something, they don't come at it from a point of defense. They come at it as I'd like to know more about the thought process behind that decision, so that rather than just accepting something, always question why it's being communicated in a different way, and why it's being said in a different way, so that you can then understand the thinking and apply the thinking elsewhere. And that moves away from tokenistic attempts of, we did one exhibition to acknowledge kind of this massive, so like for example 1984, which was a huge massacre in India, we've done one exhibition to acknowledge it, that's done. But if you haven't actually understood the effect it's had for years on communities and the pain that communities carry and what it meant to them, then you're not going to be able to recreate that as a kind of attitude change in your organization. You're just going to see it as something you've delivered and removed.
Yeah,
back to you.
Definitely. I think something I'd also like to add is that yeah, you in order to prevent making tokenistic attempts that are not authentic, it's really, as Sharon said, it's really about understanding that you will always be striving to do something, to do more. And as we've said as well, it's about understanding the core problem. So what is the problem? And as I said, it's not possible to come from an authentic place. In order to come from an authentic place, it means admitting the fact that this system that we currently all exist in, that we currently all benefit from, some of us more than others, was built off of colonial oppression. And if you can admit that, that's when we start to do the necessary work. And because, you know, it's something that has existed for so long and for so many years, you can imagine how long it takes to really restructure and reshape something that has been existing for so many years. And so this conference alone is not even enough. There's more that needs to be done after this. There's more conversations that need to be had. It's looking at what is it within the curriculum, what is it within the things that we do that reinforce the idea of whiteness as the norm? What is it that supports the British's pursuit of social control? What do we do that supports that? For example, what viewpoints do we tell in the history lessons? What journal articles, whose names are on those journal articles that we're asking the students to go read? Are they white, straight males? Or is it, you know, are we telling the perspectives of many different people? Are we trying to merge, you know, the East and West societies and trying to teach people about those two things? For example, in my degree, MSc in mental health, it's an interdisciplinary degree. And so what we're trying to do is learn about how the current diagnostic system doesn't work in Eastern world. So in Africa, for example, it doesn't work. And so the lecturers are constantly talking about what can we do to ensure that it honors both West and East. So things like that, where you are really trying to restructure things from the ground up. And I hope this doesn't demoralize anyone to say that the work needs to be done constantly, but truly, I think we need to reckon with that fact if we're actually going to make structural and long-lasting change. Otherwise, then we risk making these attempts where it's like, here, I'm going to give you this little thing. I'll give you a Black lecturer, then I'll give you this article. Then you have to understand why you're doing it, because that will ensure that you carry on doing it and that you're coming from an authentic place. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. And sharing that responsibility, it shouldn't just be down to the person of colour in the room, or because you have seen firsthand some of those like people's experiences, that's what makes you kind of want to care. It's sharing that responsibility. Like, I'm not in any physical pain or of ill health right now, but that doesn't mean I can't care about the health system in this country and all of that. And it's applying the mentality of, just because it's not affecting you directly ever, or even right now, it doesn't mean that it's not something that you shouldn't fight for as well. I'm just going to start to go to the Q&As because we've got about 15 minutes left and someone's putting a question in. If I click, okay. So someone's asked, I think it's a few questions in one, so I'm just going to break it down. Someone's asked, is BIPOC the new adopted term as opposed to BAME? There is an older generation that subscribed to the term politically black, and they put the quotation marks on me. So how do you actually navigate language or labels? And are there any arguments that BIPOC is more North American? Want to jump in on that?
So I actually spoke to Kehinde Andrews about this, I think about a week ago. We talked about language and the term that we use to refer to people who are not white. And he says that he prefers the term people who are racialized. And then we started to get into the conversation. I think something we have to really start to think about is, what is this need to group people of color together and give them a label? Because for white people, we just simply say white people. So why not just say black people? Why not just say Asian people and respect the fact that that then divides into South Asian and so much more? Why not just say, why do we feel this incessant need to group people of color together and then give them a label? That alone says something about the system that currently exists. And it says something about the way that we view people of color and the way that we regard them. And I think that that's something that everyone should start to consider before we even say, what term should we use? We should say, why do we even need to use a term? So I use BIPOC very loosely. I don't necessarily agree with the use of any specific term, because I think that it is unfair. And as I said, it others people of color. So it makes it seem like, okay, there's white people and there's people who are not white, and we're going to group them together into this one thing. And so that's what happens when we use terms such as BIPOC and POC. So I don't necessarily like to use any of those terms, but for the sake of conversation and for the sake of ease of conversation, yes, I think I settle with BIPOC, but sometimes I'll say POC. So really, they're quite interchangeable to me. But as I said before, there shouldn't even be a need to group us together and give us a label to begin with. And yeah.
Yeah, echo that. My sort of discussion on it. So for me, BAME, it's very problematic, but also if you think about the way it has been used and for what context it's been used, it's born out of those contexts and born out of those kind of ideals. So to carry it, and it very much was a government, and it was very much done for the purpose of finding out your ethnicity and labeling and all of those things. So if you continue to use it, you're reinforcing those. And I fully believe that language is a way of kind of, whether it's subconsciously or subliminally reinforcing like ideals and beliefs, even if you don't think that you're doing it or you're not aware. An example of this is the fact that we've always said minority ethnicities. We're not a minority. We have been minoritized. And that's what I really appreciate about Kai sharing about racialized, because again, it's the thing that's been put onto us and projected onto our communities, as opposed to us being that thing and then labeling us as that thing. It's very clear that it needs to be, even the language needs to shift that responsibility as well. I was going to say, and in terms of BIPOC and POC, the way I've kind of understood the differences in that term is that, so if you don't know, BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Colour, and POC obviously stands for just people of colour. And I think it was to pay respect to the differences in experiences. So people seem to think that it's a white community over here and it's all people of colour existing in one kind of unified community, and that's not the case. They're very, very different. There's anti-blackness in South Asian communities, there's issues between Asian communities, there's issues within the realm of that like people of colour community. So it's to pay, and also the way they're treated is very, very different. The way Black people are prejudiced against is very different to the way South Asian people would be, for example, in different situations. And again, so many of the factors. So it's to kind of pay respect to the fact that there, an acknowledgement that there are different experiences. Personally on the project, we generally use people of colour because our project is to do with the physical discrimination based on one's skin colour. And we didn't think it was fair to say BIPOC if we aren't then accentuating the difference in those experiences and giving the space for that. However, when certain events are ran So I know the Lunar residents, when they ran a specific event that did actually talk about those differences and did actually, the point was acknowledging those different experiences, then we use that term so that we're not kind of giving a false promise as well, because we also don't want to do it the other way around where we're acknowledging by POC, but then we're not actually following through on that because we are a much broader, we're working much broadly at the moment. There's another question. So with regards to the museum, I was wondering what other tactics are used to decolonize the museum apart from the four mentioned? So Curate Program, Governance, Lunar and Unlocked. Those are specifically for our project. Are there other big factors? I'd say I don't know how to say no, because we work in those strands, but I think the big factor is how we combine them to sort of create like a new meshed factor. So for example, like sadly, a lot of curator and decolonization work gets left to like learning teams in museums. It's brilliant. Learning teams are fantastic, and they are what kind of have the biggest effect on audience and impact. However, the way that learning teams then sit within the wider museum and the governance of that museum is very, very different. And it's quite sad, because then I think things become tokenistic, because then it affects things like we're realistically, we exist in a system of like funding and stuff like that. So it's about making that work across all of those departments. We've been in kind of like trustee board meetings, and we've consulted on like policies and stuff to broaden that actually it shouldn't be an equality and diversity policy, although we appreciate that now it's still needed. And that's another key point I want to raise, that when people say things like, you know, Black History Month should be every month, or that equality and diversity shouldn't just be one policy, it should be everything. The point is that we're still in a situation where we need to raise that awareness at those times. So although it'd be great to kind of move into that equality and inclusivity all the time, it still needs its own space because of the amount of damage that has already been done. So you actually need to give it a separate space and then kind of take that work wider. But that's what we mean about attitude shift in the organisation. So your director in collections should be seeing the relationships with the audience as important as the learning team that works directly with them. They should see the importance of diversity, and I broaden now diversity to obviously mean not just people, but diversity in experience and narratives, and like the fact that everyone is always going to be diverse to each other. That should be kind of spread. So I think it's the combination of things that we use to kind of tackle that. Tara, did you want to answer anything on that?
Yeah, I just want to add something. I think that's something that's to be said as well, is that within these programs, the biggest thing that's being done, not just in the museum work, but we're also, especially people of color and other people as well, also decolonizing our minds, as in every single day. I mean, some of the things that I knew and understood, some of the ideas and beliefs that I adopted, I learned through working with Don't Settle. Now I walk through life as a person of color, and I interrogate every single thing that I see. Whereas before it was very much, I think I was very much in a place of complicity and just accepting that this is just the way it is. And so I think the biggest thing that all these various programs do to the people who take part in the programs and who lead the programs is that they really help you as an individual to decolonize your mind and to change and restructure some of your beliefs, which are the result of colonial oppression and the systems that we've lived in. And so it forces you to confront everything that you think you know, and then to kind of unlearn that, and then to learn something new, and then to walk through life as a completely different person with so much more awareness. And yeah.
Next question. How important do you think ownership is in helping decolonize? I'm interested in the idea of taking control through claiming the right to have as important a voice as anyone else, and in representing different voices. Good question. It's a hard one, because obviously I don't think it's a case that you can only represent Black stories if you are Black. You can only represent South Asian stories if you are South Asian, and you can only ever accurately and authentically do that. And that's also just never going to be the reality of the situation we're in. People do have roles, and people do exist in different realms that they're going to have to take that ownership. However, I think it's being quite honest with yourself that I can never say that I've taken ownership of, say, a Black story or a Black experience. but I can be honest about that, and that doesn't mean I can't communicate it out. But in terms of how I'm reaching that final point, it's bringing in people that do directly have ownership of that story. Yeah, I think, and I'd like to ponder on that question a little bit more.
Yeah, and I think it's about so in representing different voices. So I think that's interesting. So the thing, what Don't Settle does, I don't see them as representing different voices as much as they amplify different voices. So I think that would be the key thing to try to do. It's not about trying to figure out how can I represent South Asian voices and things like that. I think it would be great if you can, but it's very difficult to come from a first person perspective, and truly we do better when we do come from a first person perspective, because then I can truly say this is my experience and I can speak from a place of, like I said, personal experience. And so I think it's not so much about representing different voices, it's more about amplifying different voices. And in terms of, yeah, so that would kind of be what we strive to do. I think also it's about allowing the various people of color to occupy their own space, and they can do the best job at doing that. So allow them to exist in their space and allow them to speak for themselves. And if they can't, then yes, then amplify their voice if they can't do that for themselves. Because we know that messages can get distorted when they're not coming from the direct source, and you never truly want to do that. And I understand the need to want to represent different voices, but it can become a bit, it can lead to doing more harm than good. So yeah.
Yeah, and you've really kind of proven a point that we talked about earlier, which is selective language. So I really appreciate you switching that to kind of amplifying, because that in my head has just clicked a lot more. And it's really like, it's the intention that's important there. In terms of when you said how important do I think ownership is in helping decolonize, I think very, because the point of decolonisation is that it kind of stripped a lot of people of ownership of things, and therefore a lot of communities of ownership. And that's actually one of the kind of the pain fractures that's been left in those communities. So and it brings into then the conversation of kind of appropriation, not just of culture, but of story and of ownership. And that, I think I think the relationship between decolonisation and ownership is huge. The way we kind of practically play that out is a much bigger discussion and conversation, but that's kind of the point. And it then again becomes that, I think one of the biggest problems with cultural appropriation in all sense of the term, like including narratives and stories, is that things are exploited, but then things only become okay or accepted or widely talked about because white individuals or white organizations or whiteness is the norm element comes to play, that only then is it okay, only then is it seen as something that originally already had value, but now it's kind of a weird power play of it's only become valuable because of those individuals, and then it reinforces a hierarchy. So then if that idea of ownership is still being communicated by the same way without that inclusion and without that amplification as you go along, it's doing the same thing, as in it's essentially taking another thing and it's re-stripping people of that ownership as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think we're at the end.
Yeah. Got a message.
Yeah, thank you both so much for that session and that discussion after. That was some really useful and in-depth kind of insight, and kind of what was particularly useful was bringing insights from like outside of perhaps the traditional places that us in students' unions and universities have kind of been having these discussions. So thank you both so much for that. Is there anywhere in particular that you would like to direct people if they want to follow your work further?
Yeah, in the chat I'll just put our social media. So on Twitter we are at We Don't Settle, and on Instagram we're at _We Don't Settle. I can drop my email if anyone's interested as well, if they wanted to kind of have further chat. And also, as kind of the last screen, I wanted to just put up 2 quotes from young people that have been involved. So obviously, again, just sort of amplifying young people's voices more so than ours, if that's all right. Just leave that as an end screen.
Yeah, of course.
I'll just do that now. Do you want me to drop my email or?
Completely up to you. I need to disappear fairly swiftly after, so it probably won't be up for long.
I'll just drop it in the chat now. not just for our socials. Cool, but thank you very much, and I hope you all enjoyed it as well and it was useful. And thanks, Tara, for joining us and for sharing so much as well.
Of course, it was great. Thank you everyone for letting us be here.
Yeah, definitely, and thank you for coming along, and thanks to the members in the audience who took part and asked such good questions and kind of kept the conversation going at the end. It was
definitely
really interesting.
Think about. So thanks for the questions as well.
Thank you.